Germany, 1945. Snow drifted across a shattered American command post while artillery blasts rattled the frozen walls like thunder. Inside the darkness, a single radio hissed with bursts of static as exhausted soldiers sat silently beside broken ammunition crates, too tired even to curse. Mud hardened beneath their boots. Lamps flickered weakly above maps stained with water and blood. Every field telephone line outside had already been destroyed. Then the men heard it. Engines, heavy ones. Somewhere beyond the forest, steel tracks crushed through ice and trees with terrifying rhythm. The sound kept growing. One soldier whispered that it had to be tanks. Another muttered that no ordinary armored column sounded that large. He was right. Nearly 700 American troops were about to face 4 SS Panzer divisions moving through the winter darkness. And they were completely alone. The only thing still connecting them to the outside world was a young radio operator desperately adjusting shattered equipment with trembling hands, praying the signal survived long enough to reach American artillery positioned miles behind the line. The Germans believed the trapped Americans would collapse before dawn, never realizing one fragile radio signal was preparing to unleash catastrophic artillery fire soon. Germany was collapsing by the winter of 1945. Allied bombers turned entire cities into burning ruins, while fuel shortages crippled German armor across the front. The Luftwaffe barely existed anymore, and Soviet forces were already tearing through the east toward Berlin. But Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. Instead of retreating, he demanded savage counterattacks that sacrificed thousands of exhausted soldiers for the illusion of momentum. And when those counterattacks came, they were often led by the Waffen-SS. Even late in the war, SS Panzer divisions carried a terrifying reputation. They fought with fanatic discipline, advanced through artillery fire other units avoided, and left behind memories of massacres from Normandy to the Eastern Front. American troops understood exactly what it meant when reports mentioned SS armor moving nearby. The men waiting inside the frozen defensive line were not elite heroes. They were exhausted infantrymen surviving on little sleep, limited ammunition, and shrinking hope. Snow soaked their boots, frost covered their rifles. Some had already fought for weeks without proper rest. Yet the position they defended mattered enormously. If German armor punched through this sector, thousands of Allied troops farther behind the line could suddenly become exposed. The problem was communication. Phone lines had been shredded. Runners disappeared into shell fire. Vehicles lay burning across icy roads. Only one long-range radio still worked, and every man there knew their survival depended on it. Somewhere beyond the forests, unseen engines continued moving closer through the snow, growing louder with every passing minute to night. Inside the frozen defensive line, the waiting felt worse than the shelling. Men slept beside ammunition crates because there was nowhere else to rest. Frost gathered across helmets and rifle barrels, while weak cigarette embers glowed through the darkness like tiny warning lights. A few soldiers sat quietly beneath torn blankets, writing letters home with stiff, shaking hands, fully aware those letters might never leave Germany. Others hid fear behind exhausted humor. One infantryman joked that if the SS captured them, at least they would finally get warm food. Nobody laughed for very long. Near the damaged command post, the young radio operator kept adjusting dials with nervous fingers, listening to endless static between transmissions. Beside him stood a veteran sergeant who had survived Normandy, France, and Belgium, though the deep exhaustion in his face made him look decades older. Nearby, a teenage replacement soldier cleaned his rifle repeatedly just to keep his hands busy. Across the room, an artillery observer studied maps under flickering light, calculating distances silently while explosions echoed somewhere beyond the forest. Nobody truly knew what was coming. Rumors spread through the trenches in whispers. Tigers, Panthers, hardened SS veterans transferred from the Eastern Front. Then the sounds began again. Distant engines, metal tracks grinding across frozen ground. Trees cracking somewhere deep in the darkness. One soldier stared toward the woods and muttered, "If they come all at once, we're finished." But hidden behind the fear was one terrifying American advantage. U.S. artillery coordination had become one of the deadliest systems of the entire war. And the nervous young radio operator was not simply transmitting messages anymore. He was preparing to direct destruction itself. Before dawn, the forest suddenly came alive. Engines roared through the darkness as Panther tanks emerged from the fog like moving shadows, their steel tracks crushing frozen earth beneath them. Behind the armor came half-tracks packed with SS infantry, while machine gun fire ripped through the trees in violent bursts. Mortar rounds slammed into American foxholes, throwing mud, snow, and bodies into the freezing air. The line nearly collapsed within minutes. Several defensive positions vanished beneath the first assault, and field telephone wires were shredded almost immediately by shell fire. Now only one connection remained alive inside the chaos. The radio. Inside the damaged command post, the young operator shouted artillery coordinates through bursts of static, while explosions hammered the walls around him. Outside, the battle settled into a horrifying rhythm. German armor advanced, coordinates were transmitted. Then American artillery crashed down with catastrophic force. Entire tree lines exploded into splinters and smoke. Tanks disappeared inside rolling fire while the earth shook so violently soldiers could barely stand. But each bombardment only slowed the SS advance instead of stopping it. The Germans kept coming. American officers were killed one after another as the defense fragmented across the forest. Soon enemy armor pushed so close that soldiers could hear German voices shouting through the smoke. Then shrapnel tore through the command post. The radio sparked violently, the signal weakened, and for several terrifying seconds nothing answered back. Then the radio answered, weak at first, buried beneath static, but alive. Inside the shattered command post, the young operator wiped blood from his hands and grabbed the microphone again, while artillery shells detonated outside with deafening force. Every coordinate he transmitted carried impossible pressure now. One mistake would not just miss the Germans. It could wipe out the Americans still fighting beyond the trees. Across broken radio channels, terrified voices screamed for support, while artillery officers miles away desperately calculated firing solutions through interrupted transmissions. The operator could hear panic spreading between units as German armor pushed deeper into the defensive line. Still, he kept talking. He listened to wounded soldiers begging for help while simultaneously directing artillery fire onto advancing SS tanks. The psychological weight became unbearable. Every explosion he requested saved lives somewhere and ended others somewhere else. Then the Germans began understanding what was happening. The devastating artillery strikes were not random. Someone inside the American perimeter was guiding them directly onto the assault formations. Suddenly, the command post became a target. Grenades crashed through shattered windows. Flamethrowers lit the darkness outside in violent bursts of orange. Walls shook as nearby buildings collapsed beneath tank fire. American soldiers abandoned fragmented trenches and rushed to defend the radio room itself with rifles and machine guns. At that point, nobody cared about rank or assignments anymore. The line between infantryman and radio operator disappeared completely. Every exhausted soldier inside that frozen position understood one terrifying reality. If the signal died, they died with it. The German assaults kept coming in relentless waves. Panthers rolled forward beside self-propelled guns, while SS infantry advanced through exploding forests under constant mortar fire. Every few minutes another coordinated attack slammed into the shrinking American perimeter, slowly crushing the line beneath overwhelming steel and manpower. Inside the defensive positions, ammunition nearly vanished. Riflemen searched dead soldiers for spare magazines, while medics ran out of morphine and bandages. Snow, once bright with winter frost, turned black beneath smoke, blood, and churned mud. Still, the radio operator continued directing artillery with terrifying precision. Soon American shells began landing dangerously close to friendly positions. Entire groups of soldiers survived only by pressing themselves flat against frozen ground, while artillery detonated around them like earthquakes. Then came the final desperate decision. The Americans called artillery directly onto their own lines. Men braced themselves inside collapsing foxholes as deafening explosions consumed the battlefield in fire and smoke. German armor disappeared inside rolling blasts, while advancing SS infantry was torn apart beneath catastrophic bombardment. The earth shook continuously until the entire battlefield resembled the end of the world itself. Even surviving German crews hesitated now, staring through burning smoke at a defense that refused to die despite impossible odds. Relentless artillery, collapsing trenches, and soldiers who were barely conscious. And finally, after hours of brutal fighting, the German momentum began slowing. Not because the SS lacked determination, but because the cost of advancing had become unbearable. Morning arrived with an almost disturbing silence. After hours of non-stop artillery, screaming engines, and collapsing earth, the absence of sound felt unnatural. Smoke drifted slowly across the frozen battlefield where burned German tanks sat buried in snow like destroyed monuments. Bodies from both armies lay half-covered in mud and ice, while wounded soldiers wandered through the ruins in stunned silence, searching for medics, friends, or simply direction. Somewhere inside the shattered command post, radios still crackled faintly through bursts of static. The Americans slowly began realizing the impossible truth. They had survived against 4 SS Panzer divisions. But victory did not feel heroic. It felt empty. Many of the men who defended the line hours earlier were gone now, replaced by silence and scattered equipment frozen into the snow. The young radio operator finally removed his headset and noticed his hands trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion and shock. Nearby soldiers struggled to hear properly after endless artillery blasts shattered their hearing during the night. Others simply stared across the battlefield at destroyed German armor blackened by fire. The German offensive had failed. The line held long enough for Allied forces behind them to regroup, helping accelerate the final collapse of Nazi resistance in Europe. But standing among the ruins that morning, none of the survivors were thinking about history. They were thinking about the men who never walked out of the snow. In modern war, nations trusted massive machines to decide victory. Tanks crushed cities. Bombers erased entire skylines. Artillery transformed forests into burning graves. Steel, fire, and industrial power dominated the battlefields of World War II. But sometimes history depended on something far smaller. One voice, one signal, one surviving connection inside the darkness. The American defense had been far more fragile than it appeared. If that damaged radio had failed permanently, artillery support would have vanished within minutes. The defensive line would have collapsed beneath overwhelming SS armor, opening the road behind them to further German attacks during the final desperate months of the war. The men who survived that night were not fearless heroes from propaganda posters. They were exhausted soldiers barely functioning beneath terror, cold, exhaustion, and constant death. Yet somehow they continued fighting long enough to hold the line together. And in the end, that was enough. Smoke still drifted across the battlefield long after sunrise. Destroyed tanks remained frozen beneath falling snow, while the damaged radio continued releasing faint bursts of static into the silence. 4 SS Panzer divisions brought steel, fire, and terror into the frozen darkness of Germany. But in the end, one fragile radio signal held them back.